Good morning. It's on? Oh, yes, it is. Good morning, everyone. This is impressive, early in the morning on the third day of a conference, that so many people are here. And this is an important panel, and I am very proud to introduce the woman who will open it. And her name is Fatou Bensouda, who is the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Before she takes the stage, I just want to make a personal comment about the fact that one of the well-known Supreme Court justices in the United States, Antonin Scalia, died last night of natural causes. This starts a big discussion in the United States about all of this will play in our presidential politics, but as someone who knew him and who appreciated the fact that though we disagreed on many issues, he was brilliant and active in so many judicial causes. I want to say, and I think Anne-Marie Slaughter, my colleague, would agree, that he will be missed. And now it is my pleasure to introduce another brilliant jurist who will introduce today's topic of human security.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to express first my sincere appreciation to Ambassador Ishinga, as well as his tireless staff, for their gracious hospitality and for this unique opportunity to share a few reflections on human security as seen through the lens of international criminal justice. It is indeed an honor to offer these brief introductory remarks before the illustrious panel composed for this session will engage in rich discussions on this important topic. Advancements in healthcare and technology have increased our life expectancy, affording humankind the ability to escape a life that is, in Hobbesian parlance, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Yet this apparent human success story eclipses a shameful failure to address an indiscernible fact that in the modern age, our new century has already seen countless destabilizing conflicts around the world, resulting in great losses in both blood and treasure. Regrettably, each year, countless children, women and men, are either affected or fall victim to unimaginable atrocities and extremism. Grave crimes, such as those reported in Syria and Iraq, and in many other parts of the world, shock the collective conscience and threaten the peace, security, and well-being of the world. We must curb the destructive impact of conflicts and rising extremism on civilians. Let me be clear. There is no rationalizing mass violence and extremism. No moral imperative, earthly or divine, would license the commission of atrocities. On the contrary, humanity's moral conscience must be outraged by bankrupt ideologies and radicalism and propel into action to stop despicable crimes and hold perpetrators accountable. My thesis is as follows. It is my firm conviction that the law can be an important guarantor of human security. Certainly, the International Criminal Court and domestic judicial mechanisms have important roles to play in this regard. Accountability matters to sustainable peace and stability, and it is key to averting the vicious cycle of violence and retribution. The International Criminal Court, as you know, has its origins in the aftermath of the Second World War, and the principles established in the ensuing Nuremberg trials, where individual responsibility for war crimes was reaffirmed. It was recognized that the horrors witnessed during war and conflict should no longer be tolerated and that the individuals most responsible for such heinous acts, no matter their official capacity, status, or rank, must be held accountable. In this sense, the ICC, as the first permanent independent international criminal court, can helpfully curb the ill-conceived practice and destructive effects of war and violence as politics by other means. Through its work, the ICC can also help ensure a more systematic compliance with humanitarian norms by all actors involved, as well as to serve as a means of protection. A case in point is my office's investigations of attacks against humanitarian aid workers and peacekeepers. These crimes can have a devastating impact on the protection of civilian populations. We have also ensured the conviction of individuals responsible for recruiting children to take active part in hostilities and are actively investigating and prosecuting sexual and gender-based crimes in various situations, as well as the deliberate attacks against historical monuments and buildings dedicated to religion and culture. In this work, we are only led by the evidence, by the law, and the strategic priorities I have set for my office. It is crucial that those involved in warfare have a solid understanding of the legal framework, such as provided by the Rome Statute. Indeed, to a large extent, this framework informs the legality of conduct on the ground. In these efforts to contribute to human security, my office is currently conducting preliminary examinations in a number of situations spanning the globe, from Afghanistan, Palestine, and Iraq, to Ukraine, Colombia, and Nigeria, with a view to determining whether there is a reasonable basis to proceed with an investigation. I have ongoing investigations in the situations in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Darfur, Sudan, Kenya, Libya, Central African Republic, Mali, and most recently, with respect to the situation in Georgia. Atrocity crimes that shock the conscience of humanity must not go unpunished. Any effort to ensure that justice is served, whether by collection and preservation of evidence, including through modern technologies, and initiatives to establish judicial processes at the national or international level, are to be encouraged and intensively pursued by all the relevant actors. The ICC is only one part of the system of international criminal justice created by the Rome Statute. As custodians of this system, ICC member states must vigorously and effectively carry out their responsibilities to investigate and prosecute, and thus contribute to the fight against impunity and human security. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at present, the ICC has more than 120 states parties to the most recent addition being Palestine, which joined the court last year. Much work still lies ahead, as many countries around the world, indeed, many from regional theaters where conflicts are a regular occurrence, as in the Middle East, are yet to join. Short of universality, the court's reach and legal protection will be limited. This deficit will create an impunity gap, depriving not only recourse to justice for potentially millions of victims around the world, but will also contribute to greater instability and insecurity. The MENA region in particular is in dire need of effective accountability mechanisms. The ICC, as a fully independent and impartial judicial institution, can play a constructive role by acting as a deterrent and holding those responsible for atrocity crimes accountable. It can encourage the region to move away from hot wars and increasingly lean towards peaceful resolution of conflict to deal with inter- and intra-state tensions and conflict. Taking bold and meaningful action through the vector of the law to protect citizens from the scourge of war and mass violence demonstrates political leadership, not weakness. The accountability vacuum created in the absence of justice can not only prolong bloodletting, but also the intensity and organizations of mass violence. The net result will be to undermine human security. So what else can be done to advance human security from the scourge of mass violence? Can the principle of the responsibility to protect serve as an additional component of our collective duty to protect civilians? Both R2P and the Rome Statute underscore the state's role as the first bulwark of protection of its citizens and the first line of defense against humanity. When a state manifestly fails to honor its primary responsibility, its obligation to protect its citizens, the international community should consider taking principled collective action, free from political considerations or constraints, and look at appropriate measures to avert mass atrocities in line with the UN Charter, the Rome Statute, and international law more generally. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the role of justice and accountability as an essential component of promoting human security must be embraced. As the ICC prosecutor, I am committed to do my part without fear or favor. I will conclude by observing that indeed to date, the 21st century has proven to be a turbulent time. To be sure, challenges standing in the way of realizing human security in all four corners of the world are many. Yet, there is cause for optimism. In historical times, ours is in fact the age of rights consciousness, where humanity no longer accepts that victims of gross human rights violations and atrocity crimes suffer in silence. And while archaic vices of tribalism, sectarianism, and bigotry continue to taint the pages of history, I am confident that universal values of human rights and calls for ending impunity for mass atrocities will increasingly define the 21st century. We must do all we can to ensure that security, stability, and the protective embrace of the law become a reality to be relished by all in all four corners of the world. Our responsibilities remain great, but our resolve must endure. On this path, humanity has come a long way indeed, but we have miles to go still before we sleep. I thank you.
Let me thank the Chief Prosecutor. She is absolutely right that the role of justice and accountability are crucial to the subject of human security. Good morning. My name is Jane Harmon. I am a former 9-term member of Congress. My former colleague, Nick Rahal, is right in front of me right there. And to ambassadors and others, welcome to one of the final panels of this impressive Munich Security Conference. I now head the Wilson Center. My colleague Anne Marie Slaughter heads another center, and we all are taking our government experience, I hope, to a different perspective on this important subject. I would say that this conversation on human security is even broader than justice and accountability. We're concerned about ways that war, persecution, economic pain, and environmental stress intersect. And war in particular leads itself to the conversation about law, but these other things lead to a broader conversation. And perhaps a term to apply is planetary security. That's the framework, at least, that came out of a meeting at the Peace Palace at The Hague last fall. And planetary security was used because factors including climate change can play in this incredibly important issue of human security. As everyone knows, we're in the midst of the largest refugee crisis since World War II. And the neat boxes we have used to organize our response to refugee flows have collapsed. Government is breaking down. Terrorists are scrambling nation states. And climate change, as I mentioned, doesn't respect borders. Everything old is out, except perhaps the rule of law. As the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, testified last week before the United States Congress, unpredictable instability is the new normal. He pointed to extremists active in 40 countries, 7 nations facing total collapse, 14 more where governments are severely threatened, and almost 60 at some level of risk this year. And among the 60 million individuals who've been displaced so far, as we've discussed for 3 days, every identity is represented. They're men and women, old and young, wealthy and poor, highly or just barely educated. It's an unprecedented challenge. And to face it, we need to innovate. So, what's the value added of having this conversation on the third day at a defense and security forum? The security community, in my view, knows how to adapt to new circumstances. We've radically overhauled our security business model after the Cold War, and we've certainly tried to do it again after 9/11. And so today, as we go through a paradigm shift once more on this topic, I think we need to focus our enormous capacity for planning on a new reality, one where the lines between military, humanitarian, law, and development activities have blurred. We need a shared vision to make progress on planetary security. For a long time, the humanitarian community has been focused on delivering money, food, and medicine to migrants and refugees. But in this new environment, we need to learn how to deliver something much more secure, something more durable, a future. So let's think outside the box. That's my suggestion for our panel on where we go from here, a question that has a huge number of dimensions: humanitarian finance, education, job security, sustainability, and obviously the application of the rule of law. Let's talk about the role of technology, something some of you have addressed, and big data. Let's talk about finding our solutions at the grassroots and working bottom up instead of just top down. And let's remember the stakes. We've lost at least one generation of Syrian children to this crisis. They have not been educated, and they probably have missed the critical years for education, along with tens of thousands of others around the globe, many of them in Africa. Now the fate of the next generation hangs in the balance. So my bottom line is, let's be innovative, let's have a conversation, let's minimize the speeches, and let's not just talk to each other, but listen to each other. This panel will end promptly at 10:30. I know some of you have to leave, and we will leave enough time for audience questions. So, this panel assembles some incredible perspectives on the issue. Lebanese President Tamam Salam, next to me, leads one of the nations most affected by the war in Syria. His country works every day to better the circumstances of 1.1 million refugees, and it does this despite the fact that the office of Prime Minister has been vacant for 20 months. Filippo Grandi, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, has nearly 3 decades of experience in the United Nations. He leads an organization spread across 126 countries, and he's worked on this issue in nearly every continent. Norway's impressive Minister of Defense, Ine Eriksen Søreide, sets security policy for a key NATO ally, a contributor to the war on ISIL, and a nation known for its innovative approach to humanitarianism. My colleague and friend Anne-Marie Slaughter heads the New America Foundation, one of the nation's most, or our nation's most disruptive think tanks. And she's also, she's a personal disruptor. Also a key voice on Syria policy, who previously led the policy planning staff at the State Department. And Rula Khalaf is the foreign editor of the Financial Times, organizing frontline coverage from around the world. She's also been a correspondent in North Africa and the Middle East. Thank you all for taking part. An initial comment to Filippo Grande. I got an email early this morning from Ann Patterson, who is the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. She said that they remain hopeful. Most of you heard John Kerry yesterday, that the delivery of humanitarian aid would start arriving in Syria now. Oh, any news? No news. No news. Okay, well, that's disappointing. Anyone else have news on that subject?
Just lots of pictures of trucks getting
Lots of
loaded.
pictures of trucks loaded.
Loaded, no, I
Loaded.
understand.
Well, the Kerry comment was, trucks are loaded and ready to go. No update. Okay. So let's move along. Maybe we'll get an update during this conference. To the President of Lebanon. As I mentioned, your country is hosting more than 1 million refugees, the largest refugee population per capita in the world. That would strain any country's resources, and last week, a donor conference brought in more than $10 billion for countries like yours on the front lines. What other help do you still need?
Excellencies, Mrs. Harman, to start with, I have to put something right. I'm the Prime Minister of Lebanon.
I got it backwards. You know what? Here. See, I changed it.
Okay.
This was prepared by the conference. That's why I changed it. Okay.
And one of our major issues regarding the political crisis in Lebanon for the time being is the vacancy of the presidency and the incapacity of electing a new president due to the political factions who do not agree yet on what to do. So we have to be maybe patient, but the country, as a result, is certainly suffering. It's accumulating negative elements that are hurting it. I have to start, Mrs. Harman, if you allow me, by giving a brief comment on the situation that is prevailing now in Lebanon. As you all well know, Lebanon is living a tragedy. Regarding the Syrian refugees, we have now around 1,500,000 Syrian refugees to a population of 4 million. That is certainly something, it's an unprecedented situation anywhere. I know there are refugees in other countries, in bigger numbers maybe, but in ratio to the country, I mean, in Turkey, we have maybe 2 million refugees, but you have over 60 million people. And you have a thriving, successful economy, a powerful country, not a country as small as Lebanon. I also would like to say that 85% of those refugees in Lebanon live among us, in our homes, in our villages, in our towns. Only 15% live in makeshift camps. That should tell you, in short, the hospitality the Lebanese went about exercising without any guidance or any government role that imposed it. They did it willingly. They are still doing it. And that is also to note. You should also be aware that we have accumulated almost $13 billion of economic cost over the 4.5 years. Only last year, in 2015, we had a figure of $5 billion, and those figures are World Bank figures. Not to mention that our national debt has increased from $45 billion 4.5 years ago to 70 billion this year. And all the time increasing. I remember last year when we were participating in this conference, we had a similar panel. At the time, the figures that were dealt with regarding refugees that were coming into Europe were around 10, 15, 20,000 refugees. And we had Mare Nostrum and other organizations dealing with this. And those were already creating havoc, creating a lot of uncertainties. And everybody in Europe was excited. What's happening? Only 15 to 20,000. At that time, in a panel that I participated in, I tried my best to tell everybody, if we don't do something serious and quick about this affair, you will reap only worse situation. And now, what are we talking about? 2 million, 1.2 million refugees in Europe?
And last year. That was last year.
Last year. And that created the awakening in Europe. I hope if they woke up a year ago, things would have been much better today. Unfortunately, they did not. We will keep trying to alert everybody to the intensity of this situation. I would like also to say that we participated 2 weeks ago in the Syria conference in London. And that was a fourth conference after 3 previous ones that took place last year and the years before in Kuwait. I will give some figures. In Kuwait last year, pledges were $3.8 billion. Delivery was $2.4 billion. And until only 10 days ago, we were provided with a breakdown of this $2.4 billion. So what we raised specifically in London is not only the importance of the 11 billion figure, but is delivering those pledges. And I personally suggested to the Secretary General to create a body, to create a commission to follow up on those pledges. Otherwise, we'll end up in the same situation. Now, supposedly 5 to 6 billion are to be spent this year. And I can assure you, a country like Lebanon who would want them to be spent last year, not this year. And we will require more and more aid. We have participated in London. We have had our compact presented there. It highlighted our needs in every respect, especially in education. You should know some figures there too. Yes, in Lebanon, we have 250,000 Lebanese students in our public schools. We have 200,000 Syrian refugees in our public schools, and 250,000 are still waiting to get in. So imagine how dire and difficult the situation is. I should say also, we requested support in creating economic opportunities, jobs, and traditionally, we had a working force of Syrians in certain sectors, specifically in agriculture and in construction, and we are also now in need of that working force. But to have this working force really participate and also help the Lebanese find jobs, we need some serious investments in projects, in agriculture, in construction, and in other sectors of services. I have to say also that, yes, we are reaching our limits, and we cannot ask of a country like Lebanon to sustain this situation for a longer time. And we request all the time a multi-annual, multi-yearly aid, because the matter was initially treated as if it's going to be there for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Now it has dragged and nothing in sight for a solution soon. There I will immediately, if you allow me, to jump to the political situation. Yes, the region is in a mess. Let me be frank and let me be direct. The region is in a mess. Why the region is in a mess? Because one thing should have been attended to 2 and 3 years ago, they were not. Yes, the big powers are playing around. And they are playing around until yesterday. What we heard of statements yesterday, some percentages here and there, still some trials to outbid or to gain some ground here or some position there, and it's still ongoing, unfortunately. This political situation, yes, you cannot be optimist in the midst of this political situation.
But
it is getting worse, and the mess is getting bigger. And I have been saying for some time, and I would like to repeat now, to handle seriously the conflicts in the region, and specifically to handle extremism and terrorism, everybody has to work hard in supporting moderates and moderation. And the key to that, in my view, is yes, going ahead with the peace settlement between the Palestinians and the Israelis on a two-state solution. If that is done, that will certainly create an oasis of moderation, of moderates, that will gradually overcome or limit extremism in the region. But as long as tension is prevailing in such a situation, in such a hotspot, as long as we are going to reap more extremism and more destruction in the region. We have to be clear and blunt about this thing. And I would also like to say today, what is it? Human security? Or is it social security? Or is it educational security? Or economic security? Or security? Yes, it's all of those together. Right. And we are asked to handle them. Yes, we will give our thoughts, we will give our positions as much and as best as we can, but it will always be the duty for the big powers, including Europe, to take major, effective decisions that will solve matters, not make them more complicated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And let me offer again the fact that Lebanon singularly has per capita handled more refugees than any other country, and you've done it in a fashion that not only, as you said, 15% of them are in camps, but the rest of them are integrated across your country. It's a model for other countries under dire circumstances. And the other issues you raise, I think most people in this room would agree with, but I want to stay on this topic and go down the row and ask some questions and get to the audience questions. For High Commissioner Grandi, your agency was first set up in 1950. At that time, it was given just a 3-year mandate, after which people expected the refugee problem to be solved. If you could rebuild your organization from scratch now, facing the problems that we face now, how would you do it?
Most likely we will recreate the organization as it has been, because it has served a very important purpose, saved millions of lives, preserved the institution of asylum, and help people find solutions to their plight. So I think the problem is not with the organization. The problem is the context and the responses that have been crafted and implemented. This panel focuses if I understand correctly, on crisis, on prevention, on responses. And I want to share, in line with what you just asked, a few reflections from the angle precisely of my organization. Hello?
Someone's not sure what you said.
Okay.
Please continue.
I'll try to be clearer. So the angle, the context that I'll speak, the background that I'll speak against is the context, of course, that is of concern to us. An unprecedented global refugee situation, 60 million people, you mentioned that, Ms. Harman, 60 million people between refugees, internally displaced, other forms of displacement, plus 10 million stateless people that are also very much of our concern. They have become, and the fact that there's so much spoken about in this conference indicates that displacement has become both a symptom and a cause of insecurity. Now, I believe that you're quite right, Ms. Harman, that the causes are multiplying, but failure to solve war continues to be the greatest cause of displacement. And inadequate handling of the consequences aggravates the impact of displacement. There are many crises, mostly in Africa, but also, of course, in the Middle East and other places. I will use Syria also to keep in line with Prime Minister Salam. I will use Syria to illustrate 4 failures which are now perhaps 4 opportunities. The first, and I go back to the prosecutor's introduction, is the fact that international humanitarian law in Syria has been blatantly violated for 5 years by all parties to the conflict, without, let me stress, without much encouragement by the friends of those parties to do otherwise. Access to victims and to internally displaced people has been minimal. This has caused untold hardship and suffering, and has also favored the exile beyond Syria's border of 4.5 million people. The opportunity is the one that you mentioned at the beginning. We don't have an update. I've asked my colleagues to see if there is a last-minute update, but the fact that trucks are loaded, let's take it as a positive sign. I also believe that it is good that political talks have yielded as first result, have given priority to humanitarian access, but that access must finally happen, and when it starts to happen, it has to last. It cannot be simply for one day. You know, when I was in my previous job with UNRWA, I went to Yarmouk. Yarmouk is one of the most embattled outskirts of Damascus, and we negotiated access for days and days. Finally went in, brought relief. Soon as I left Damascus, after 2 days, everything collapsed again. And then for months, they didn't receive any aid. So this has to be sustained. Access to victims and displaced and other people in need will help them, of course, and will prevent, hopefully, further displacement. My second point is the point that the Prime Minister of Lebanon just very eloquently illustrated. There has been woefully inadequate investment in neighboring countries, in Turkey, in Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. The countries that have hosted 4.5 million people. This is 5 times the number of people received by Europe altogether, the entire continent, last year. And these are 4 countries, especially some, Lebanon, Jordan, with not unlimited resources, fragile infrastructure, and big political problems, as has been explained. And what has not been invested enough in is long-term needs. You mentioned that in the beginning: education, jobs, support to host communities. Now we've had the London conference. I share very much the view of the Prime Minister. 11 billion is a great figure, actually much better than the previous ones. Let's see whether that money is invested. First is contributed and then spent in the right manner. Short-term needs need to be covered: health, food, and so forth, but also longer-term needs and the needs of host communities, and that will contribute to also stabilize refugee communities and host communities. My third point, I have four. My third point is a bit more technical but interesting. Refugees in the region have not been offered over the past few years adequate, safe and legal pathways for admission to third countries. Many of them need that, both to relieve the countries of first asylum and also because they're particularly vulnerable and need resettlement or have other needs like scholarships, family reunification in Europe, in other countries in the industrialized world. That has been very inadequate. People can't avail themselves of these legal pathways, and therefore what do? They resort to criminal networks, to smugglers, sometimes to traffickers. Now, the talks between the EU and Turkey, the so-called Joint Action Plan, which has been discussed for the past few months, includes a huge component of resettlement, hundreds of thousands of people. That's a good sign. And we ourselves at UNHCR, on request of the Secretary General of the UN, are organizing a conference at the end of March to promote legal pathways out of the region for Syrian refugees. We aim at 10% of the population. That seems small, but it's 450,000 people. That would be a considerable relieving of the responsibility of host countries, but it has to be done. So another opportunity that, if seized, could have important effects, including, like I said, relieving the burden, but also offsetting the power and impact of criminal networks. And finally, the European Union, because this is where all these inadequacies have pushed refugees toward. In the European Union, for the past couple of years in particular, we have seen many failures. Very inadequate sharing of responsibilities, very little cooperation among states in dealing what they themselves term a refugee crisis, no measures, no adequate measures taken at the external border of the European Union. Now, staying with the European Union, all the right decisions have been made. Hotspots, relocation, distribution of refugees across Europe in an equitable manner, return to their countries through humane means of those that are not recognized as refugees, but they have not been implemented. Although, since I have become High Commissioner, at least I can judge the last few weeks, these only 6 weeks, I have seen some momentum towards implementation. That also needs to be implemented in order for Europe to receive refugees in a better manner, to safeguard the institution of asylum. All the world looks at Europe for that, to protect the security of the continent. And I hope I don't sound too dramatic, but I've heard every panelist in this conference say the same, to prevent the collapse of some of the most basic elements of the European Union. My final point, all these are suggestions, opportunities on how best to deal with the biggest, but not the only, crisis of refugees. But if peace doesn't come to Syria, and that's the biggest failure and the biggest opportunity now, perhaps, all this will be inadequate. All this will be inadequate. Access inside Syria will collapse in a few days. No matter how many resources we invest in neighboring countries, they will be inadequate and they will be destabilized. Legal pathways for admission will be insufficient, and I believe Europe, under pressure of an increased refugee flow, will raise barriers instead of managing the flow properly. So the most important opportunity that we seize now, that we must seize now, is what was discussed in Munich a few days ago, and it is to bring an end to the war in Syria. Thank you.
And let me just add to your excellent points that if we can do that, then there won't be more refugee flows. Hopefully, people will prefer to stay home or return home.
Yeah.
Right. So turning to the Defense Minister of Norway, whose country is in this part of the world, What are your observations on what was just said, and how is it that Norway has, like Lebanon, been able to devote considerable resources to the refugee problem when so many other countries don't?
Well, I think first and foremost, I have to say that I share Jim Clapper's assessment both from Congress and that he repeated here on Friday, that I think that the key words of what we're seeing at the moment is the unpredictable instability as the new normal, and I'll get into that in just a minute. I think that when we look at human security, it's impossible to do that without looking at it in a strategic perspective. The sheer magnitude of the human suffering right now, I think, is overwhelming for all of us. And I think we're all looking at ways in how to alleviate this suffering. The problem is, however, that if you look at the Syria crisis right now, that is actually a very good sum up of many things that has strategic implications. One of them being that it is a proxy war with huge geopolitical implications. Secondly, what we have seen as maybe one of the most obvious results also in Europe is that where we earlier on believed that geographical distance was the same as safety, now we see that things happening far away has a direct impact on our security. I mean, the terror attacks we've seen in Europe and many places also in the Middle East and North Africa are very good examples of that. Thirdly, we see that as a result of many of these issues, international law is under pressure. And international law is, I fully agree, it is in a way a first line of defense for many of these issues. And if that continues to be under pressure, I'm afraid that we will have less opportunities to both prosecute breaches of international law when that happens, but also to have that stable framework around our societies. And thirdly, what we have seen as a result of the enormous refugee and asylum seekers flows both within the region but also to Europe. I mean, people are fleeing their homes, they are fleeing a humanitarian situation that is awful. But at the same time, it has created a more polarized debate, especially in Europe. And my concern is, and I've used an expression that I think also it could be used here, that I'm a bit concerned, not a bit, I'm very concerned about the health condition of European politics. And the reason I'm saying that is because the more polarized this debate tends to be, the more problems we will have as European institutions, the democratic institutions, in actually alleviating human suffering and also making decisions that could ultimately also have a security policy impact. So I think that when we look at this from a bird's perspective, I think there are many issues interlinked here that, in my opinion, are of concern in addition to the obvious human sufferings we see as a result of this crisis. We decided from a Norwegian perspective, and this is a long-standing tradition, I can say that also because my predecessor as the defense minister, Espen Barth Eide, is here as well, a long-standing tradition in Norway, both to put emphasis on what we can do to actually make sure that people have basic needs covered. Norway was took one of the initiatives to the donors conference last week in London, and we have decided to allocate about 1 billion euros the next 4 years to Syria and also to the countries around. 15% of it should go to education, because I think that's obviously something that is definitely needed in addition to other needs as well. And then secondly, there is also a tradition, and I think is important to remember in these days, that sometimes military means are needed in order to change the situation on the ground and thereby pave the way for political solutions. And what we see right now in Syria is an example, in a way, of the opposite. When Russia is now bombing Aleppo and supporting Assad, it makes it even more difficult to get a political solution. The appetite for a political solution is diminishing by the hour from Assad's side. So that is also an example of both the geopolitical, geostrategic consequences this has, but also the fact that sometimes, from a different perspective, military means is also needed.
Thank you. Turning to my disruptive colleague, Anne-Marie Slaughter, you've written a very provocative piece on robots and refugees, and what you describe as a situation where refugees with access to the latest digital technology, people who are on Facebook and Twitter, live in conditions that are medieval. And the obvious question is, if technology is already there, how can we leverage it to get to better results?
Thanks, Jane. I think that may be the best introduction I've ever gotten as a personal disruptor. I'm going to put that on my business card. So let me say one quick thing, supporting the defense minister's view and turn to your question about technology, just to underline that human security is not a humanitarian issue. Let me say that again. Human security is a security issue. It's not a humanitarian issue. It's a security issue for multiple reasons, and I'll just give two quickly. One is, and we learned this lesson after World War II. This is why we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after World War II, because we recognized that had we understood the way in which Hitler treated Germans within Germany in 1933, we might have been in a very different place in 1939. It's never simple, but that was the global recognition, and that's the global recognition today of responsibility to protect. That when a government like Bashar al-Assad tortures 10-year-olds to start, and then makes very clear that he will stop at nothing to stay in power, and he's not alone, and they're not only atrocities on his side, that is the sign to the world that unless you act early, you will reap the whirlwind, and that's exactly what we're doing. And the second way in which it's geostrategic is that we are now incubating another generation of extremists and terrorists, of all these kids who will not get an education, who will have seen the world abandon them as their families are massacred, and who will then do what humans do in that situation, which is to seek revenge. So that seems to me, in these contexts, the 21st century is about understanding that focusing on what happens to individuals on the ground is as much a security issue as when an army crosses a border. So how do we use technology? So a couple of ways. One is, what I wrote about is that these are, for the first time, you are seeing these waves of refugees. They're enabled by criminal networks, absolutely, but they're also enabled by secret Facebook sites that tell them exactly where to go, what to do. When they land on the island of Lesbos, they're told, but through Facebook, slash your boats, because that way you cannot be sent back. Here are the tents you have to buy. Here are the places you have to go. In real time, as they're moving to Europe, they're hearing, this border has been closed, this place you can get through. So we're seeing technology being used to enable refugee flows. And then the question is, well, how do you use technology either to monitor or to stop refugee flows, or more importantly, to create opportunity? So to stop refugee flows, I think part of what Frontex will be doing is figuring out how you actually monitor these kinds of sites in ways that obviously from civil liberties and privacy point of view may be troubling, from a security point of view is going to be essential. So you actually use the same signals, you use cell phones, you figure out where people are communicating, how people are communicating, and that's where you intervene. But equally importantly, it seems to me, we need to think about how can you use technology to create opportunity for the refugees who are in Lebanon, who are in Jordan, who are in Turkey. How can you provide much better online education and online technological training? I mean, I was at dinner last night with a very high official at Google who says, you know, I have an unlimited budget for hiring, but I have a dramatic shortage of talent. Well, you have concentrations of people, many young people, who, if in fact you see them as people who will go back one day, or even if they don't go back, then are people looking for employment, looking to make a better life in the countries they're settled. If you think about providing opportunities from the various tech companies around the world to provide training, to actually see them as a vanguard of people who can be trained in new technologies and new jobs, that's a very different way of viewing them rather than as refugees who basically get the minimum. So I think there are ways we can think about technology in terms of stopping refugee flows, monitoring them. I'll just give you one more very concrete example. So in India, with biometric identification, you have 1 billion people who have who have biometric identification, and that's connected to their cell phones, right? So you now have the ability to identify people and to know where they are. You think about that in terms of not just fingerprinting people, but giving them identification where you can then track them for disruption, but then how can we also think about using tech training and even entrepreneurship training for creating a set of new opportunities? So I'll stop
So
there.
you see why I call her a disruptor? But just a couple of comments on what you said. You said human security is not a humanitarian issue. My response is it becomes one if security isn't protected. And therefore, not only budgets of countries are strained, but every agency we have that was designed in the last century to deal with these situations becomes inadequate to the task. And technology is a huge part of assuring that the humanitarian aid that has to come, because we haven't protected the security and we don't have a path forward to protect the security, that the humanitarian aid is delivered hopefully on a transparent basis and actually gets to the people who need it.
I
Fair?
don't deny that humanitarian aid is necessary, particularly if we don't treat it as a security issue to begin with. What I'm pushing back against is this notion, well, there's geopolitics and that's the hard stuff, and then there's all the humanitarian stuff that we do, once we have these refugee flows. That is a geopolitical issue. That was
I
just-
agree.
yeah.
And just one other little factoid. Steve Jobs' natural father was a Syrian refugee. It's worth thinking about. Okay, turning to our journalist friend. Your personal role in all this has been very interesting, but would you also address the question of what role journalists can play in not just telling the stories, but in figuring out solutions for this horrendous problem?
I think we tend to think of ourselves as journalists, that we identify the problems and we leave it to people like my colleagues on this panel to find the solution. But what we also do is try to analyze how we got here. And what I wanted to get into on this panel is precisely that. We've spent the last 3 days hearing, frankly, mainly about 2 issues: the migration crisis and Syria. And I think that the question of, why are we here? Why has Syria, in effect, become a European problem today? And my first observation on that is that I think we have essentially overlearned the lessons of the Iraq War. We rarely speak today about Iraq, but the shadow of Iraq is still very, very present. Iraq was not a humanitarian intervention in the sense of humanitarian interventions. It could have been. In fact, I think I would have been more supportive of it had it been a humanitarian intervention. But it was fought on the basis of both faulty premises, and it was also fought on the basis of faulty expectations. And it was so badly executed that the mistakes have been hanging over us since then. I live in the UK, and it's very telling that when the parliamentary debate on intervening in Syria took place, it was all about Iraq. And I think similarly in the US today, President Obama's reluctance to intervene in Iraq is based on the inability to see what it is that an intervention will bring. Because the Iraq example has been disastrous, but we also have, sadly, the Libya example. And Iraq was a full-on military invasion. Libya was intervention light. And so when the issue of Syria was put on the table in front of the American president, this is what he had to look at. In reality, Syria is not Iraq. Syria is not Libya. To me, a humanitarian intervention in Syria would have been Iraq post the first Gulf War and not the second Gulf War. And that was a pretty successful humanitarian intervention. It was at the time when the Kurds and the Shia, who had been persecuted, were protected through no-fly zones. And I think today we can see, I went to northern Iraq about a year ago, and had it not been for that no-fly zone, I think you would have a very, very different situation today in northern Iraq. My second point about humanitarian interventions is that when we face a situation where the UN Security Council is paralyzed, the answer cannot simply be that we sit back and do nothing. I think what you need at a time like that is leadership. And I think the fact that everyone looks to the US for leadership at a time when the US itself, because of the internal debate, because of the pain of the Iraq war, is itself paralyzed, then there is no one else to take the lead. Even today, when I speak, I've been speaking to European officials over the last couple of days and saying, well, can you do anything about Syria? Are the Turks expecting you to do anything about Syria? And the answer is no. Unless the US moves, no one else will move. The result of all of this, of course, is that you end up outsourcing these problems to regional actors. And I think, I would be right in arguing that by outsourcing the problem of Syria, you have exacerbated the humanitarian situation because you've ended up with so many actors fighting each other. The level of suffering of ordinary Syrians, and indeed the number of displaced, has only increased. And my third and final point is that we have seen over the last few years an attempt to create different tools for intervention. Sanctions has been, in some cases, a very, very valuable tool. Smart sanctions in particular. And I think that in this toolbox, while sanctions have played an important role, they have a limit. In the case of Syria, for example, the Syrian economy was not integrated in the rest of the world, and therefore sanctions had a very limited impact. So while sanctions are an important tool in the toolbox, they cannot replace what at times does need to be a military intervention. Thank you.
Well, I want to congratulate this panel so far in keeping speeches down and content high. I think this is an extraordinary collection of people and important information that has been disseminated. So now I'm going to do a surprising thing for the Munich Security Conference and leave enough time for the audience to ask questions. Are you impressed with that? I hope so. The woman in the back, or it's not a woman, it's a man in the back in a blue sweater.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Hans Morris from German National Public Radio. I report from Geneva regularly for about 5 years, unfortunately, about the Syrian war. Mr. Grandi, I was at your first press conference, and my question goes to you and the Prime Minister of Lebanon. There's one thing I cannot quite understand. You say we need billions of dollars for the refugees, but at the same time, billions of dollars are being given to the traffickers you mentioned. There are estimates between 5 to 10 billion. Isn't that somehow completely contradictory and also a perverse situation? Thank you.
Start with, I don't know where you got the figure of 4 to 5 billion, because the whole affair, if based on the cost that is being asked of those people who are being transferred by boats, is around $1,000, $2,000, and we're talking about what, 1 million people? Well, that's what, 1 to 2 billion at most. So who gives that money? Well, those traffickers are asking those people for this money. If we were able to create some job opportunities, some decent living conditions for those refugees, they would not have been trying to go elsewhere. So yes, yesterday we heard the German Minister of Defense outlining clearly the importance of putting an end to those traffickers and to following up their rounding up and preventing them of trafficking. Well, that is also a major job that has to be handled. We cannot do it, and I have to be also very frank there. In Lebanon, only partial trafficking took place. We are talking of maybe tens of thousands, not more, 10 or 20,000, in comparison to what came from Turkey. And let me be clear, yes, at one point in Lebanon, a few months ago, some were saying, why are you missing this opportunity? The Turks have allowed hundreds of thousands to flow to Europe and have cashed $3 billion from the Europeans. Why are you trying to restrain this? Why are you blocking it? And we are in Lebanon, not helping those traffickers. No, let them create a fleet, an ongoing fleet. You will reap more aid. So this certainly is a delicate situation, and I share with you the importance of not supporting the traffickers, not allowing this to go on.
Commissioner?
I have little to add, but maybe a couple of points which may be of interest. One is that, of course, traffickers and smugglers are everywhere where there is a bad situation that obliges people to go further, and they have no other option. You know, this is not just Syria. I was in Ethiopia a few days ago. I visited a camp for Eritrean refugees in the north. The phenomenon is identical. And actually what these networks do is incredible, because they organize travels for thousands of kilometers across the desert, all the way to Libya, for example, or now to Turkey. They're very flexible in the way they organize their pathways. That's why I spoke earlier about the need to increase legal options, safe options for people to get out. Otherwise, they will always go to this. Otherwise, they may even spend the money that is given to them as assistance to avail themselves of the smugglers. And can you blame them? You know, I was born after the Second World War in Italy. I was born near the Swiss border. I remember stories from my parents, from their contemporaries. During fascism, Jews, for example, and other people persecuted by the regime had only smugglers to avail themselves of to get to Switzerland, which was very near, but that was the only way. Now, today we look at those smugglers as heroes, that they were offering an opportunity to people that were in a bad situation. So I think we need to look at these things from that perspective. They're bad, we need to counter them, but most important, we have to solve the causes and meanwhile offer safer opportunities for travel.
Thank you. Is there any young leader in the audience? I said, there she is, that I would recognize you first, and I'm sorry, I'm recognizing you second.
That's okay. Thank you so much for giving me this space. I'm speaking on behalf of the young leaders of Munich Security Conference. We are 26 of us. And my name is Shafak Pave. I'm Turkish parliamentarian, member of NATO Parliamentary Assembly, a former UNHCR person, actually. But I'm here asking the question on behalf of all our group and to all panelists, if possible. Well, it seems like the global consequences of the displacement, global migration and immigration will not only affect today and tomorrow, but the next century. And unfortunately, the concept of my generation, which is living side by side or together, is fading away before our eyes in our own time. And that is so sad. And that is being replaced instead by the word security. So we need urgent solutions, as our great, gracious moderator has said, sustainable solutions, and urgently, both for the humanitarian needs as well as to prevent further migration moves. Under this concept, I would like to thank the Prime Minister also as a Turkish response that agriculture gives people peaceful roots, and that is also a common solution that we can find by directly monitored funds to the local authorities and farmers. So, but now my question to all panelists, please, is under the UN's underpinning pillars of peace and security, development, and human rights, what is your one solution under either of them, very specifically for steps for us to remember to focus? And one thing for the new High Commissioner, I wish you good luck in your new term. Could you please share with us a very sustainable humanitarian model that has been successful so far? Thank you.
So that's a better formulation than I was able to do. Let's have one solution per person, and let's start at the far end.
And I'm
One.
so sorry. Happy Valentine's to everyone.
Ah. Only one.
Right. So I'm going to go for resettlement. I think that one of the major problems over the past few years, and what has led to the migrant crisis in Europe and to the scale, is the lack of an orderly managed resettlement policy.
Okay, Anne-Marie.
The one solution I would give, and it goes back in some sense to the prosecutor, is that the UN adopt a resolution that says a government that shuts out journalists, or where a government shuts out journalists, the United Nations will create a website of verifiable videos, and the standards used would be the same kinds of standards you use for evidence in the court as to what is in fact happening, so that early on in these kinds of atrocities, a government that shuts out journalists, so we do not know what is happening, and when we find out in Syria, it will be on all our consciousness for decades. There will be a verifiable global source of what is happening, so that at least in the propaganda war, you cannot claim this did not happen.
You're here. Commissioner.
I think in reality, I disagree with the question. If the pillars are three, peace and security, human rights and development, all three have to be acted upon in order to achieve human security in the sense that Anne-Marie was talking about. Now, if you oblige me to make a choice, I would say, please, let's invest more in better conflict resolution mechanism, update them from 1945, we're in 2016, and therefore peace and security would be my main focus, but without the other two, you don't go far.
Defense Minister.
With the risk of oversimplifying, I don't really think that there is one single answer to this question, but I would like to underline the fact that there is no development without security. And that's why I think that those two are so integrated, and that's why we have to see this also in a more strategic perspective than looking at them one by one. So if that could add up as one solution, well, then I'll go for that. Otherwise, I think it's a bit too simple to talk about the one solution.
Prime Minister.
Well, first I endorse Anne-Marie's idea, which is quite original, and that leads me to stress on the political solution. And that, in turn, leads me for a bigger role for the United Nations and for the Security Council, again, to pull together and try to put together a solution in the midst of that big mess that is prevailing.
Thank you. We will now take a few questions together and leave the panelists a chance to sum up. How do I do this? Of course, I see Joe Nye. Let's see. We'll take you in the blue shirt right here. We'll take the woman in the back with the scarf. That's 2. We'll take the woman over there in the gray, and we'll conclude with Joe Nye. And I apologize for others, 2 others. Right over here first.
Thank you. Christian Berg Harpviken from the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. Thanks for a very interesting and innovative panel. 3 brief comments. The first one to Rula Khalaf. You said that you thought there were 2 cross-cutting themes in the conference, namely Syria and refugees. I think there is a third one, which is perhaps less pronounced, and that is terrorism. The terror threat to the West, to Europe and the US in particular, which expands the conception of security that underlies this panel as well. Secondly, and this is a lead-up to a question I'd like to ask you, Filippo Grandi. We are discussing as if our understanding and our knowledge of the refugee situation was such that we should have been able to predict the situation we currently are in with great certainty. I think that's a dangerous misrepresentation. I've been working on migration myself for the past 10, 15 years, and I think our ability to predict the drivers of migration, to understand the dynamics of migration, still is very limited. And I think it would be very hard put to find anybody who, with great accuracy, would have been able to predict the situation we currently are in as little as 1 year ago.
So what is your question?
The third issue leads up to the question. The question is, what is the UNHCR doing to improve that situation as we speak? And by extension, there is an underlying issue here which we haven't really touched. There is a security-refugee interface in the sense that refugees are susceptible to militant and political mobilization in their own right. That's a quite important subtopic in this context. So I'd like to hear not only how the situation is monitored in general, but how one deals with that particular aspect.
All right. Thank you. Now we're taking all these questions together and giving a chance to sum up. Over here, yes.
Alison Smale from the New York Times. We're talking a lot about smugglers and their key role. Does anybody have any idea exactly how many smugglers, excuse me, we're talking about, and what mechanisms do we have outside of the Turkish authorities for controlling them in checking their activities, stopping their activities? Should we be stopping their activities because they would arise anyway? It's a simple human need, but I just don't think I've seen anywhere an estimate of exactly how much money they're earning, how many people are we talking about, and couldn't we perhaps learn some lessons from what they're doing so we would have an organized flow?
Thank you. The woman over here in the gray jacket.
Thank you. My name is Birgit Reitsch from German television. I want to ask the High Commissioner. Yesterday, the French Prime Minister Valls told us that France doesn't want allocations of refugees in Europe. Is this the end of a European solution of the crisis?
Thank you. And Joe Nye. And again, apologies to the rest of you.
My question
next year.
My question is primarily for Rula Khalaf, though Anne-Marie may want to jump in because she and I have argued this many times. One can be a believer in human security and in the connections that have been described. But the question is, how do you deal with unintended consequences of humanitarian interventions? We had a humanitarian intervention in Somalia, and it produced our inability to prevent genocide in Rwanda. We had a humanitarian intervention in Libya, and it's prevented our ability to do something about Syria. I would like to know, when you appeal for American leadership, what exactly do you want now? In other words, and how do you know what the consequences will be? If you, I mean, tell us what you want, and then tell us how you're going to protect against unintended consequences. For example, an ISIS regime in Damascus, or lots of other possible unintended consequences.
Thank you. All right, so predicting migration and all related to that, details on smugglers, the Prime Minister Valls' comments about France, and a cosmic question about humanitarian intervention. I think that's enough to organize concluding remarks, and maybe we'll start with the Prime Minister.
Well, my concluding remark would be, we have to remember that this year, the Munich Security Conference actually started on Thursday night with a 6-hour meeting of all the countries' foreign ministers concerned of the situation in Syria. I think that influenced the conference, that influenced the whole climate around it, and that has been the major propeller of so many thoughts, so many ideas. In that sense, I would like to commend here and wish the best of luck for a certain person, and that's Stefan de Mistura, for all the hard work he has been doing and still is maintaining, in spite of all the negative results here and there all the time. And again, I say, yes, regarding this trafficking, until now it's a $2 billion affair, which is substantial, and which is luring for many to go about doing it if they didn't do it until now. I hope we can use different ways and means to stop them. I know we have to also revert also to law and to justice to put things in order. Then again, I have to give an outward plea to the big powers, to Europe, to take into consideration all that and not stay sorting out matters their ways and having people, countries, communities paying the price every single day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Norwegian Defense Minister.
Thank you, Jane. And I'm not trying to answer directly some of the questions, but to sum up with a couple of points. One is that one of my greatest fears is that because of the influx of asylum seekers right now to Europe, we will over time be unable to provide refuge to those who have the most need. And the challenge is that that is deeply rooted in Europeans. We fled from a war ourselves, and we want to protect and we want to give refuge to people. But if the influx is of such a magnitude that we are unable to actually pick out those with the biggest needs, and then I'm fully aware of that it is also a need and is also legitimate to seek a better future for yourself and your children. The problem is, however, that if we are unable to bear that, then we will also have to shut the gates for those who is in dire need of protection, which I think would be a very dramatic standpoint for Europe to take. So that is also something that we need to get a handle on, and that's why the support to the regions most affected is also so important, to be able to provide something to people that are in need in different ways. Then secondly, when it comes to the discussion on the unpredicted consequences that Jonah was alluding to of humanitarian interventions, well, I think no one is able to predict exactly how a humanitarian intervention will play out, both directly and in the long term. And I think that one of the results that we see from Libya is that Russia felt that they went along with something in the Security Council that they later regretted, and in hindsight, that could possibly be one of the reasons why they have been blocking action in the Security Council right now on Syria. I don't think that was easy to predict at that time, and I think that the choice the world was left with in 2011 in Libya was whether or not to take action against a brutal dictator who was slaughtering people. And I think that there is a cost also of not doing something, and that is also a choice. And it has consequences that could also have long-term effects. Thank you.
Yeah,
And High Commissioner, yes.
I got many questions. I don't think I can answer all, but I'll try to address at least some of the points and make some final conclusions. First of all, I have not heard this statement of no education in Europe. If that was the question, maybe I misunderstood. Actually, I think, and I'm sure the Norwegian minister will agree with me, that if refugees arrive and are received, education is one of the most important things to be provided in order for integration to be successful. I also would like to reply to the first question of Ms. Harman. I don't have very good news. The latest update from Syria.
On the trucks?
The request for cross-line assistance to 4 areas was submitted on Thursday. Since then, no response from the government yet. And as stated, we are ready to move within 24 hours. In another message that I received separately, it reports that fighting and bombing are still occurring in some of those areas. So for the time being, no progress. We have to continue to hope. I agree with Prime Minister Salam that we need to support Stefan de Mistura in every possible way. And we shouldn't undermine the drive, but the situation is difficult. My final point addresses some of the other questions and wraps up. I'm not sure I fully understand the question about prediction. What I was trying to say in my initial point was that when the Syria war started, there were some responses that could have been put in place, were not put in place, although frankly we and others said they should. And that had consequences that now make the situation much more difficult to handle. That was my point. But it gives me the opportunity of say a few more words of the bigger picture. You know, I worked in many places, as was said before. Just picking the main operations I've been involved in, you know, the Cambodian refugees in the 80s, then Sudan, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Great Lakes region of Africa, and Palestine. None of these situations, and I've been working for 30 years with refugees, none of these situations, save Cambodia, Indochina, has been resolved. Now, this is a stern message that comes to us, and what does it say? One, that we have been unable to either stop wars, because some of those wars have been going on for 30 years, or we have been able to prevent the recurrence of war through adequate peace building. I think that where the international community is the weakest is to build peace after the war has at least temporarily ended. You know, I spent many years in Afghanistan. Our operation helped repatriate 3 million people. Now Afghans are the second largest groups of refugees arriving in Europe. What does it tell us after 15 years of investment in Afghanistan? There's something wrong there, something to reflect upon. And what does it say that Indochina was resolved? It was resolved, and this answers the question of the Turkish friend, former staff, you know, a good model. Those were good models. Political leadership, clear focus on solution, international cooperation. That was the manner in which that conflict was eventually resolved, and its humanitarian consequences as well. Thank you.
Anne-Marie.
So I'll try. I just want to address Alison Smale's question because it's important, and I don't know the answer of how many smugglers there are. But I would emphasize something that President Ghani said, and actually Moises Naim wrote a very good book about 15 years ago. The smuggler networks and licit networks, the smuggler networks and narcotics networks are often the same, so the illicit networks, but they are completely interconnected with licit trade networks, right? These are the same families often, or the same organizations that do a certain amount of licit trade and a lot of illicit trade, or trafficking, which is what we call it when it's illicit. And which I just want to emphasize because it means there are ways of actually even using the smuggler networks to turn more toward licit activity, toward actually supporting people toward legal immigration. You have to think about these networks as tools that we can use, and rather than sort of imagining there's this criminal world here and a non-criminal world. So Joe, I have to respond. There are always unintended consequences. What I would say is we have continually confused humanitarian intervention with regime change. And that's exactly where we've gotten into so much trouble, right? So when you talk about no-fly zones, those have worked, right? And even in Kosovo, our goal was not to overturn Milosevic. Our goal was simply to stop him from what he was doing in Kosovo. And in Libya, had our goal been only to stop Gaddafi from massacring those in Benghazi, we would have had a very different approach than the approach that was pursued, which was ultimately to not stop until he was gone. What I would have said, what I argued for in Syria 4 years ago and would argue today were no-fly zones, but equally, we should have bombed Assad's air force after chemical weapons and after barrel bombs to simply say, we're not going to intervene militarily in the civil war. We are going to tell you, under international law, you may not fight the war this way. You may not gas your people. You may not drop barrel bombs on your people. We will act. The international community will act, and then we stop. And then we see what that does in terms of creating incentives for a political solution.
Let me add that hindsight's always better, but there were numbers of people who held that position 4 years ago, and
Yes,
I personally did, and I think things would have been substantially different if that had happened. Rula, you have the last word.
Well, I'm going to pick up exactly where Anne-Marie left off. I think what you have to take into account is the cost. And I'm convinced that the cost of inaction has been greater than the cost of action. I cannot think of a scenario for Syria that is worse than what we have today. I simply can't. And in fact, it is so bad that I don't believe that there is anything that can be done today, even no-fly zones. Today, that means going to war against Russia. It's too late. And I think whichever way you game it, you can't end up with a better situation. In fact, I think even with the ceasefire announced a couple of days ago, we are likely to see an even worse situation in the coming weeks, with potentially 2 new actors entering, the Turks and the Saudis.
Well, I can't let us end on that note. That is too depressing. I would like to go back to the initial comments by the chief prosecutor and observe that if women like her have a position like that, there is a better future for the world. Thank you very much for coming.